Welcome to Nonprofit Thrive, a podcast where we learn from the humans who are helping nonprofits succeed in the digital world. Now, let's get started with the show.
Welcome. I'm Ben Freda, host of the show, where we share the leaders. Do we share the leaders? No, we share the stories of the leaders. I guess we share the leaders and their stories. The leaders in the nonprofit space. That's the people behind the organizations, the foundations, the companies that help nonprofits change the world. Past guests are many and varied and wild, kind of like the cuisine in Queens. Which is just over the bridge from where we're recording this now. Anyway, but our show has a diet of nonprofit technology. Past episodes include very first episode of the show, Ryan Osmick of Soapbox Engage. We talked about CRMs and how to think about them. Hat tip to Ryan because he introduced me to today's guest, which I'm very excited about. But his identity, today's guest, will have to remain a mystery for yet a few more seconds because I also want to point you to another episode. For instance, if your taste turns more towards the aesthetic or the musical, check out the last episode. That's just the last episode of the podcast. Hit the back button one time and you can listen to an episode we just recorded with Rachel Rossas-Gallant of the League of American Orchestras, who discussed how she was able to sort of increase the engagement of orchestra listeners at her nonprofit. Also talked about ways of turning those people off, which you may want to avoid. So listen to that if you get a chance. For today, how could we ever match the quality of those past guests? Well, we do, and I'm going to reveal his identity in a second. But before we do, I have to let you know that today's episode is sponsored by BFC Digital. BFC Digital. At BFC Digital, we help nonprofits thrive on the web. If you work at a nonprofit or a foundation or another type of social change organization, I'm sure you know that unless you're doing a big old project like a rebrand or something, it can be very difficult to find reputable, high quality, responsive, friendly help for your website and your web issues. If you have a site, you need it to be contributing to your mission, not holding you back. And that is what we can help you do at BFC Digital. We can help you fix your bugs, redesign your site's resource library. We can integrate that new donation system, maybe a Salesforce integration to your web presence. And we can do it all for a small monthly fee. And we never make you fill out a support ticket because support tickets are terrible. Go to BFC Digital to learn more. So today, finally, I am ready to let you know who today's guest is. Very excited to have on the show the one and only Watt Hamlett. That's Watt Hamlett of Watt Hamlett Consulting, and also the bass guitarist of Mandatory Recess, the most awesome rock cover band in Northern Virginia, DC area. And I know that's probably what you're most interested in, friends, but he also has been able to squeeze into, between gigs, an entire career as a nonprofit technologist. Started as a web developer, now has moved into the Salesforce ecosystem, has worked in a nonprofit, the National Alliance of Mental Illness. So he's worked in-house at a nonprofit. He has also worked as a consultant outside of nonprofits, helping them integrate Salesforce into their workflow. And he is here to talk about all of that. Watt, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Ben, thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.
So, the first question I tend to ask people is where you grew up and what you wanted to do when you were a kid, because I think that's interesting in terms of tracing where you ended up. So what about you?
I grew up in a small town in Central Virginia called Farmville. Mm-hmm. And it's not the huge metropolis that the name would suggest.
Or the inspiration for the original Facebook game.
Yes, it's not just a game that ended relationships on Facebook. It's an actual town.
Who knew? Who knew? Okay.
Yeah,
So
as I like to say, Farmville is the state's leading exporter of low self-esteem. That's no.
Wait.
Farmville it was actually a very lovely place to grow up. And
if you don't like self-esteem, it's a great place to grow up.
Some people still manage to have it, even if they kind of no.
God, what is it about Farmville that pounds it out of you?
You know, I don't know if I have a good answer to that, because you know, maybe a lot of people feel this who kind of grow up you know, in smaller communities, and you sort of always assume you're less than the people who are in, you know, in bigger cities and more exciting areas. But you know, so I was happy to leave to go away to college, but you know, as time has gone by, I've come to kind of really appreciate the unique time and place that that Farmville really was. And you know, believe it or not, there's some people of note who have come from Farmville.
Other than yourself.
Other than me. Way bigger than me. So this guy named Vince Gilligan is from Farmville. And
he created Breaking Bad?
Yeah, he's the creator of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. Right. And his mom was my second grade teacher in elementary school. Wow. And his brother was a classmate of mine, and Vince was a few years older. Wow. But yeah, one of my tiny claims to fame is that I got to go trick-or-treating with him, you know, when we were all in elementary school. I'm sure Vince has no memory of me, but you know.
That's you know, it's funny too, because I once read a profile of him in the New York Times, and I think they did focus on the angle of, hey, here's one of the very few creators on TV now who focuses on everyday people in everyday towns. Because Breaking Bad, of course, Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is the opposite. I think there was, and I might be getting this wrong, but I believe the article contrasted Breaking Bad with Mad Men. And Mad Men was the metropolis, glamorous, sophisticated, stylish show about New York. And Breaking Bad was the everyday guy in Albuquerque. It's not very stylized, you know, but maybe that's the Farmville, I'm pronouncing it like you, Farmville influence right there.
It could be. I think the other thing, and this is a part of my story, and you know, as it turns out, Vince's story, is the elementary school that we went to was attached to the local college, and it was a like a laboratory school for the college's School of Education, and so they really focus on trying to be innovative and you know, forward looking in the way they did education. And so I felt like I was really a beneficiary of that. And so like one example is, you know, we would have access to things from the college campus, and one of those was video production. And I remember, you know, Vince actually in elementary school would take the college AV equipment and go out and make these short films, and then they would show them to the students in the school.
Really?
And that, I think, for me, that also sparked a real love of kind of media and creation. So to answer your question, that was kind of one of my earliest professional goals, was to be an entertainer, to be in the media. I wanted to be a stand-up comedian for a while.
Really?
And do something in TV, radio, film. And thought even leaving high school, that would kind of be the route that I went down. And I did not end up doing that. And instead pursued a different interest going into college, which was architecture. And I did one semester of architecture in my freshman year, and quickly realized that, at least for this particular program, that's basically all I would be doing all of college was architecture. I would live at the architecture school, and I would do 4 years of architecture, and that would be my life. And at 18 years old, I just thought that I'm not ready to make that kind of commitment. So I started casting about for something else to focus on in college, and, you know, ended up in liberal arts. Did not think that was going to be my thing. I was very practical minded as a young man, and just thought, if you're not going to school to learn something that's going to get you a job, what's the point? And then I just lived to eat those words over and over again, double majoring in religious studies and psychology, going on to get a master's of divinity degree. So I did a master's in theological studies with the intention of that, I was going to become a professor. I was going to teach in this field.
Wow.
That's really the thing that kind of ended up lighting me up there for a while.
And by lighting you up, you mean your interest in religions?
Yeah, in religion and in academia. Now, my mom was a college professor, so maybe I could have seen some of that coming. Just growing up and kind of seeing what she did and kind of seeing the life that she led. I think that was, kind of an example and maybe a role model for me. But yeah.
Wow. Okay. So a whole bunch of things, stand-up comedy included, and then architecture, and then theology. So after college, you had this, you had a theology major, you had a theology master's degree. What made you not want to go into academia, or what sort of short-circuited that? Because right out of college, it looks like you were a web developer.
Yeah. So about halfway through my master's program, I suddenly didn't want to be in school anymore. I thought that day would never come. I loved school. School was my thing. I was a student first and foremost. And about halfway through that program, I just thought I kind of ready to not be in school anymore. I went ahead and finished the degree, but this was at Emory University, and while I was there, I had a on-campus job in the campus media center.
Okay.
Where we would make copies of audio tapes for language classes. We rented out the AV equipment for the school, but there also was a kind of a sort of a creative computing lab that was part of this multimedia center. And this was in 1993, 1994. And this thing called the World Wide Web has been invented and launched. And so, while I'm working there in this campus job, I'm learning HTML and what a web browser is, and FTP. Right. And so, and what's interesting in retrospect is that the web, the introduction of the web really brought together what had been two of my interests, which was communication and architecture.
I never thought of it as an architecture related thing, but it makes a lot of sense. But say more about that.
Yeah, just in the sense of here was a set of tools that would allow you to build things, build places that people would go to, would visit, would spend time in. And so I think, I wasn't really conscious of this at the time. I just thought this was kind of pretty cool that I could type something on one computer and it could show up on another computer.
Yeah. Right.
But yeah, so then that part-time student job, it was really just kind of for money and fun, ended up really setting the course for my career ever since then.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So when you started at doing that in 1993, 94, I started doing it in 98, 99. So very similar, but were you start with HTML, I assume.
Right.
And was CSS a thing back then or no?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. So you were just HTMLing it probably with tables, right? You're just doing tables.
Even that tables was kind of advanced, in the beginning, like,
sure.
Totally. It's like, if you didn't want something to just come down the left margin of the page, you had to get creative with, and then the table was a solution to that. But,
one of the things I have a fantasy of doing is creating sort of a basics course for so many of our clients are nonprofit communications people, right? Who are dealing with website stuff, dealing with digital. On one day they might be doing Salesforce, and another day there might be a huge bug on their site they don't know how to fix, all kind of stuff. I sort of have this fantasy of what's a one weekend course you could give somebody at a nonprofit that would give them enough sort of facility with like these different tools so that they would at least know how to talk to a developer. And in my mind, it starts with HTML first and then goes to CSS to add styling. Then it goes to just basics of JavaScript to add some interactivity. Then it just goes basics of PHP to dynamically generate the HTML rather than just have the HTML that you have. And then it goes to MySQL or whatever the database is to sort of get data to that PHP. Do you think all that stuff is still worthwhile to talk about? Or are we now way beyond, so far beyond that it's not even a foundation that people need to have?
That's a great question. I mean, because I thought the last thing you're going to say is then you use a chat GPT prompt to have AI just do it all for you.
Do it all for you. But that's the thing. If you do use, I mean, you can do that, but then is it still useful to know why all those things, how they work together? I mean, that's how I learned it, but maybe that's not useful anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think, you could, if you extended that same kind of concept backwards, you'd be talking about getting into, operating systems, which are abstractions on top of ones and zeros, which are,
maybe you could though. Maybe that'd be worthwhile. Maybe knowing how computers work, why your ones and zeros are stored on the thing, and how it's electricity. I don't know.
I like it from the sense of just, I think the agency that it could help people feel. Because what you're making me realize is that, so, my domain now is Salesforce.
Yes.
Salesforce is just a website.
I mean, I guess. Yeah.
It's all the same stuff, right? It is. I mean, I ought to know what it's actually built on and running on, but at the end of the day, it is HTML. It runs in a web browser.
Exactly. Yeah, totally.
But it's for my intents and purposes and working with my clients, none of that really matters, right? I mean, there may be some things that you're trying to design within the context of Salesforce, but mostly you're just using their UI and the components that they've built, to give you a system to manage your organization's data.
So for your version, it would be, for the Salesforce version, it would be, what is a database? Why does a database exist? What is data? What are links between data? So you have a record of a person and you have a record of a donation. How do you link between them? Kind of thing. Is that useful? Maybe.
So, it's hard to say, right? I guess we're just so old now. We've really just lost touch with how people think these days. But, for example, I started working for a nonprofit.
Yeah.
That didn't, before they really had a computer. My first time working for a nonprofit was an internship I did in college. And I worked for an organization based in DC, and they maybe had a computer for word processing, but it wasn't anything that was on everybody's desk. And so I was working with the development director, and he was fairly new, right? And so he's thinking, I've got to come in and get a handle on who our donors are, and kind of make my strategy about how I'm going to raise funds for the organization. And so part of his idea was he got himself a file cabinet, and he was going to create a file folder for each donor of the organization inside that file cabinet. And then he was going to keep correspondence and, I don't know, copies of checks or whatever about that donor.
Yeah.
So one of the things he asked me to do as the intern was to go ask the office manager if we could get this giant quantity of file folders to put this donor information in, and she said no. she said, I'm not going to get that many file folders. That's ridiculous. You don't need that many file folders. But really,
that's hilarious.
He was trying to organize information about donors in a way that he could access it, make sense of it, use it. Right. So that's part of my mental model as I think about, the nonprofits I'm working with and the challenges they have to solve. It's still kind of the same thing. I mean, you think even Windows, right? The icons in Windows they're still file drawers, and folders and documents inside of folders. It's all still relevant.
But so when a nonprofit comes to you now, do you use that analogy? Are you like, oh, you need to organize your information because you need to be able to have a folder for each donor? Or no? Are we beyond that?
Yeah, no, I don't think that's really helpful for most folks anymore. I think most of the organizations I'm working with are kind of beyond that. They generally already have one or more technology systems that they're using. They're used to managing data through these systems, and they're now either, definitely going to make a move to Salesforce or probably going to make a move to Salesforce, and they're just needing someone to come in and help them through that decision process to give them the level of clarity and confidence that they need to make the kind of investment that they're going to potentially be making in a system like Salesforce.
So many questions come out of that for me because I don't know so much about, I know something about CRMs, right? Because we do a lot of web development work and we need to integrate CRMs and all that kind of stuff all the time. So when an organization comes to you, are they, what kinds of things are you looking for to advise them as to whether Salesforce is a good solution for them? And what are the sort of the red flags where you'd be like, no, Salesforce is not right?
Yeah. So I would say just first that just as kind of to set the context that there's a lot of things that organizations can do with Salesforce.
Yeah.
So it's yes, it's a CRM, but over time, as Salesforce has built or acquired new technologies, there's probably 40 different things at least that a nonprofit could buy from Salesforce. Email marketing, analytics. Slack is a Salesforce company, right? So there's a lot that can be done with that technology, and because of the complexity of it and just kind of the nature of how Salesforce is built to work, nonprofits almost always need consultants to come in and do the implementation work for them, do the technical work to get them set up. Right. And so that's why, because of the kind of those two aspects of what it means to work with Salesforce, that's why I do what I do to help organizations navigate all of that. Because there's so many factors to consider. There's so many, again, ways they could use the tool. There's so many kinds of consultants they could work with, so many directions they could go in with the software, so much that needs to be true of them internally for Salesforce to be a good fit. So those are the kind of things I'm trying to help them work through. And if an organization just generally wants to make a technology change of some kind and isn't sure what they want to do and just wants to kind of survey all of the nonprofit tech that's out there, that's generally not the kind of project that I would take on. I would refer them. There are lots of other consultants out there who can help provide those kind of agnostic tech evaluations. Right. Where I really focus and where my expertise really lies is either you're going to use Salesforce, you think you're probably going to use Salesforce, or maybe you're already using Salesforce, but you're struggling in some way and are trying to get clarity on what's going on and how to resolve it, or things are going great and you want to expand your use of Salesforce and you want to be sure that you're doing that in the most thoughtful way. So it's really owing to the kind of the depth and breadth and the number of facets and complexity in all of Salesforce that kind of necessitates having someone like me that can kind of be a guide and an advocate to nonprofits as they're going through. And Salesforce serves all parts of the market. There are very small organizations using it up to the very largest organizations. I tend to focus on kind of mid-size and up, where they're going to be making enough of an investment in Salesforce and the related professional services that it makes sense to spend some time and money with someone like me. Just make sure that they're making a good bet, that they're going to get some return on this investment, that they're ready. At the smaller end of the market, there's kind of less at stake. And frankly, they just have less to invest. So they've got to be a little bit more, on their own in that process.
Yeah, that makes total sense. What are some of when you say like if an organization is sort of ready for it, right? So talk about that a bit. I mean, how would you know? Let's say I'm an organization and I don't know, this is a sort of a facile example, but my fundraising is kind of all over the place. My executive director does a lot of the fundraising themselves. And there's also a development director, but they don't really, I don't know. There's not that great, there's not a ton of record keeping going on. That's really good. How would you sort of say, what's the self-assessment that an organization would need to go through to say, all right, we're going to be able to handle this type of technology, it'd be a good fit, or maybe, no, we're not, we should be doing it a different way?
Yeah. So one of my primary offers or services to nonprofits is a needs assessment. So it's really coming in to address exactly those kinds of questions. And I start with what I call the journey framework, which is really just helping the organization answer some key questions. That's who are you as an organization? Where are you now? Where are you trying to go, and how are you planning to get there? And I find that's kind of that's a set of concepts that people can kind of get their heads around. It's not techie at all.
Right.
And so that's where I want to get them talking about, just who they are as an organization, their mission, what they're trying to achieve. Where are they now in terms of the systems that they're using, their processes? What are the challenges that they're having related to any of that? The current resources they have to bring to bear to their mission and broadly, and then technology specifically. And then where do they want to go? Because they're typically not going to hire me unless they think something's wrong. They need to make a change or an expansion somehow. Right. So I want to hear from them. Where are you trying to go? Is it that we're not raising enough money? We need to raise more money? Is it that processes are taking too long? Is it that we're worried that our data is too siloed? Is it that, we don't have the right people on our team to do the work that we need to do? I'm going to try to uncover all of those factors.
Right.
And then hear from them. And then, how are you thinking about getting there? And typically the answer involves at least Salesforce, at least to some degree. So they think, we're going to bring Salesforce in, and that's going to solve for these things. And I want to verify that, right? Because I've seen all the great things that Salesforce can do. I've also seen all the ways that it's failed to deliver return on investment for organizations because they didn't have the right expectations or the right resources. So those are all the kinds of things that I'm listening for. And so from there, I'm going to try to assess, does Salesforce seem like, or to what degree can Salesforce address the challenges they have and help them get to where they want to go? Okay. And that's kind of that's sort of, I think of that as the fit, like how much of a fit is Salesforce for this organization at this point in time? And then the second part of that is readiness. Are they ready as an organization from a staffing perspective, a budget perspective, a timeline perspective, from a change management perspective? Are they ready for what a move or an expansion of Salesforce is going to mean to them? And with all of that, I can reflect that back to them. I can make recommendations about, does this seem like the right time? Is Salesforce the right direction? What are the things you're probably going to need to be ready to invest in to make that happen from both the licensing point of view, professional services, additional staffing that you might need. So just helping to paint that picture for them so that they can make the most informed decision possible. Or are we going to move to Salesforce or expand our use of Salesforce? In what ways are we going to do that? What aspects of the technology are we going to use? And then are we clear and ready about what it's going to take as an organization? Sometimes they look at that and say, actually not, we got to go back to the drawing board. We're not ready for whatever reason. Sometimes they look at it and say, this all makes sense. We're going to pause and do this 6 months from now. And then sometimes they look at it and say, we're ready to go. And so if that's the case, then kind of a follow-on service that I can offer is helping them pick the right implementation partner to do the technical implementation for them. So I have a fairly I have a kind of a packaged process that I can take them through to try to do that in a very efficient and comprehensive way.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third and kind of final service that I can offer to nonprofits is, if once they get into that technical work, if they want to keep me around as an advisor and a guide, both to help them make sure they're doing the things they need to do through the process, as well as making sure that their Salesforce implementer is, holding up their end of things, then that's work that I can advise them through as well.
Gotcha. So a lot of you're like so almost like a coach. Not, I mean, that's sort of a bad way of putting it, but like you're helping people figure out where they want to go, how they can do it, giving them some advice for how to, some information on what the best approaches would be, look out for XYZ. Totally help them, preventing things from kind of going off the rails.
Yeah. And really that's the reason I started my business. So I'm in my, just finished my 6th year of Watt Hamlett Consulting. And prior to that, I worked for a company that did Salesforce implementations for nonprofit and higher ed for 6 years. Yeah. And so I got a front row seat to how this tended to go. And, often it went quite well, but it didn't always go well. And sometimes it went quite poorly. And sort of my hunch was that if there was someone who could work with organizations upstream of those decisions around purchasing software, engaging consultants to do implementations, that I could perhaps create some higher rates of success for organizations kind of going down the Salesforce route.
Totally. I mean, we see this a lot in the web development world too, where a lot of times what kicks off the process is an RFP. So someone says we need a new website, right? And they're like, oh, let's write an RFP. They write an RFP, they send it out, right? And then by that point, there's certain details that are set in stone: budget, requirements, other stuff that everyone who gets the RFP is going to respond to. But I had somebody on the podcast named Laura Quinn, who's really good at this kind of stuff, who's like, that's kind of her thing too. By the time you're writing your RFP, you've already made so many decisions, right? Like you've kind of, you've made decisions that maybe you should backtrack on a little bit. I mean, websites are a little bit easier to conceptualize, I think, for people than a Salesforce implementation. Everyone knows what a website is, but then Salesforce can require a little bit more thinking, but same kind of thing. We see that a lot. If the process is kind of kicked off by an RFP, there's a lot of thinking that may or may not have gone into it beforehand,
Right. And a couple of thoughts on that. One is that I have a saying that once you put yourself into the buyer's seat, it's no one's job to tell you no.
I love that.
It's no one's job to tell you no. Someone might, out of the kindness of their heart, say, you're not ready for this. Yeah. But it's not their job. At that point, it's everyone's job to figure out how to make it work for you. Yeah. And if you haven't come into it with the right requirements, all the things that are going to contribute to your project being a success, you're not pointed in the right direction from the very beginning.
And you can waste a lot of time and money that way too.
Yeah. And the other thing, is that, and this is true to extent, I know, in the web world, but I think even more so with Salesforce, is that most people who are tasked with leading an organization through this kind of change have never done it before.
Right.
Right. And actually I find some of my best clients are those who have done it before and who realize how fraught it can be. And they don't want that kind of hassle. Right.
Oh my gosh.
Like there's so much risk. So much opportunity for this to go poorly. I have to have someone who can be by my side to help me through this, make these decisions, watch my back.
Yes.
And make sure that we're accountable to doing the things we as an organization need to do. Right. And it's the same in the web world, right? That you can have the best external consultant in the world, but there's still so much to that process that's on the organization to dictate, to decide, to drive. And often they don't have that muscle for how can I turn around a decision about whether it's this or that when there's so many stakeholders that we have to consider. And so that's kind of where I see the value of my approach is just being able to be that additional resource that can hopefully create more success for everybody involved.
I mean, totally. And in the old days, an organization would hire somebody like you. They would have an employee full-time who manages this kind of thing. But now in these days, you can get, you can spend a tiny fraction of that and get that person essentially on your staff, helping you figure out, what's smart for you to do and what's not smart for you to do. And that's kind of where you come in. I think it's like, you're like the equivalent of like whatever, a quarter of an employee or something like that. And you can act like on their behalf, with all these other people. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Listen, the time has just flown. I feel like I got to maybe 1/4 of the questions I wanted to ask you. So we're going to have to do this again for sure. Well, listeners, all, thousands, tens of millions of listeners out there are going to be waiting with bated breath for episode number 2 with Watt Hamlett. Because again, I guess this is going to have to be a 4-parter. if we've gotten 25% of my questions. But listen, I hate to cut it off just purely because of the time limit. My last question for you really is, where can people find out more about you, what you do, what you have to say, all of that?
Yeah. So there's three things I want to mention. So watthamlettconsulting.com is my primary website, and you can get to everything from there. I also run a site called Watt's List, which is a directory of consultants in the nonprofit Salesforce space. There's 150 different consultant profiles there. So as organizations are just doing their own research and looking for who can help me with XYZ on Salesforce, that's a great place to go.
I've seen that list. Check it out. It is incredibly useful. Please, Watt's List. Google
that's
that.
wattslist.info is that. And then, of course, mandatoryrecess.com. For all things on the band. You can check out our upcoming gigs. We gig once a month, generally in the Northern Virginia area. So hope to see everybody at our next gig.
And summer's coming up. It's going to be a great time to sit outside, drink a beverage of your choice, and listen to some serious rock and roll.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, cool. Very exciting. Listen, I'm serious. We got to do this again, but thank you so much for doing it. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Ben. My pleasure as well. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Nonprofit Thrive podcast. We'll see you next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.